So recently I took a look at the Genesis Mini here on the channel, and for the most part, I liked it. For $80 and 42 games being included, and a lot of them are quality games, some of them never released even in the US or at all. Yeah, it's very compelling at that price point. There was just one issue I really had with the system, and that's it only had a 3-button controller. Some of the games on here call for a 6-button controller. Things like Eternal Champions or Street Fighter. Yeah, having to hold start and then press a button in the middle of a fighting game is not practical or fun to try to pull off. So I wanted to see that 6-button controller that apparently Retrobit was working with SEGA to create. You know, actually having an official SEGA controller released in 2019 is interesting, and the fact that it's plug and play and works fine with the Genesis Mini tells me it's probably something you want to pick up with it, but I still wanted to take a look at it for myself just to see if it was quality or not. And that's what we're going to do here today. We're going to take a look at a 6-button Genesis controller. Technically, I had 2 sent over, but they're the same controller, just different colors. And we're going to have some fun and see if it is quality and if SEGA is actually releasing some good products here in 2019, specifically their controllers. We already know the Genesis Mini is good, so make sure you guys like the video if it does help out, since I mean, I changed the desktop background for this. That doesn't just like happen. You know, there's a right click and a left click involved with that. And make sure you subscribe below with the bell on so you can get notified of any of the reviews and news videos that I do here. Last year, Retrobit and SEGA announced a partnership where they would create official accessories for different SEGA systems. Since then, Retrobit has announced several different controllers. I recently did a preview video for the Genesis Mini, and during my time with it, I realized that 3-button controllers, they really were not cutting it at all for games like Eternal Champions and Street Fighter. So after complaining about only having 3 buttons, SEGA emailed me and said they were sending me 2 of their Retrobit USB 6-button controllers to take a look at. Now, these controllers work for the Genesis Mini and are completely plug and play, but when I received the controllers, I noticed something on the front. These controllers also work with a bunch of other systems, including the Nintendo Switch. This seems so weird at first to use Genesis controllers on a Nintendo system, but that rivalry really only lives on in my 8-year-old self anymore. See, back then, if you were around during the 16-bit era, it was Genesis versus Super Nintendo, Sega versus Nintendo. They were taking shots back and forth with different ads on TV and in magazines, way different than it is now. Back then, it was the Wild West on the playground with kids arguing and almost fighting over it. And now, yes, you have people arguing online, but all these companies are so friendly to each other. Back then, they were like at each other's throats. So now you have Microsoft and Nintendo working together. You got Microsoft congratulating Sony on a big launch. Sony and Microsoft's agreeing to cloud partnerships. Way different now than back in the 90s. Looking around the box, I really like what they've done here with the packaging. It has this nice vibrant red, and it contrasts really, really well against the black, and then it has reflective lettering on the left, and it just looks really nice when you kind of move it around. It looks like something straight out of the early 90s that I would see hanging on a rack when I walked into a Kmart or a Caldor. Apparently, these stores are known as old people stores now. I didn't know this, and I was trying to figure out the definition for this. Well, after talking to some of my nephews, it turns out an old person store is a store that you bring up and then you get a 10 to 15 minute story about how awesome that store was when it probably wasn't that great and you're seeing it through nostalgia glasses. For example, I just talked about Caldor, which is old and gone. I talked about Kmart, which is, I guess, old and gone, although you could have gone to Kmart like a year ago. And then, of course, talk about things like Circuit City. And yeah, I guess it's funny to be like, I remember that store, it was great, when really it was probably frustrating to get through at Christmas time, and you probably got mad at a few of their return policies at one point in time. But if you think that's funny, think about it this way. Toys R Us will be an old person store, you know, in a few years when your kids ask you about it. Anyway, opening up the box, we have our controller cased inside plastic packaging, along with some instructions. We'll look at those a little bit later, as they are kind of important here. Holding the controller in my hands, I have to say, it feels solid, like really solid. Like, this is made by SEGA, and I just opened a brand new controller in 1993 solid. It does have the typical layout as we'd expect from the original of the 6-button controller with A, B, and C across the bottom row and X, Y, Z across the top. Start is smack in the middle, and there is a mode button at the top, similar to a shoulder button, but with way less travel. It basically just clicks. And the D-pad. Oh man, the D-pad. If you are partial to a rolling D-pad from SEGA, this is the USB controller to get. I mean, it feels exactly like that 6-button controller D-pad from the Genesis. I keep saying this, but it's true. Retrobit really seems to have done their homework here, looking back on the older original controller that we all loved using with our 16-bit Genesis, and they recreated it here with quality behind it. I mean, the only real downside right now is that it's wired. Now, some people will prefer this since it will cut down on things like input lag, of course, and you won't need to charge it or really put batteries in. But at least the cord, I guess, is 10 feet long, so it'll go much further than what the Genesis Mini comes with. But really, a wireless option would be nice with this quality in mind, even at a higher price point. Yeah, the 6-button controller makes the Genesis Mini so much more playable. I mean, the 6-button controller is the controller I would always prefer back in the day over the standard 3-button controller. I mean, it's just has twice as many buttons easily, and then also a mode button at the top. So why wouldn't you use it? I guess it is a bit smaller, but when you're using it with something like the Mini, it also has a longer cable, 10-foot cord versus like a 5-foot cord. Yes, it is way better. So it's pretty straightforward how it would work with something like the Genesis Mini. It just plugs right into the front through USB without any real issues, plug and play. With the Switch, however, you would have to be docked or have some sort of USB-C to Type A input converter. That way you could play in handheld or tabletop mode, most likely with a stand, so you can have clearance on the bottom of it. All right, now for it to work on the Switch, we have a few obstacles in front of us. For one thing, the controller doesn't have enough buttons for joysticks. That I think we already all know by looking at it. So to get around this, we need to tell the system we want the D-pad on the Genesis controller to act as the D-pad on the Pro controller. So to make this happen, we need to hold start and up for 5 seconds. Once that's done, I also wanted to change the buttons around, specifically A and B. Holding start and down for 5 seconds will do that, and now we're good to go on the Switch. Unfortunately, though, you need to do that button combination every time you turn on the system or plug in the controller. It can't seem to store your settings in the controller itself. I know it's not like a long process, but it is really annoying and tedious to have to do that every single time you want to turn your system on and play. I spent some time with games like Castlevania Collection, where the controller worked great, as well as any of the Sega Ages games. Mario Maker 2 worked fine as well, although the rolling D-pad is a bit more frustrating to me anyway to use in a platformer like this compared to using it in something like a fighting game. The controller is also not set up very well for just a Mario game in general, especially one like this, just kind of with the slanting of the buttons where you have to hold one with your thumb to run and then the other you kind of press with the bottom of your thumb to jump. It's not really set up at a natural angle like, say, the Super Nintendo controller is. Also, navigating some menus with this controller is a bit difficult in something like Mario Maker 2, considering you don't technically have R or L available to you. The buttons that you have available to you right off the bat when you're using this controller are the standard A, B, X, Y, ZR, ZL, plus, and minus. You don't have any way to press R or L when you're in the game. It's because of these limitations that I really wouldn't recommend getting this controller with the mindset that you're going to use it with every single game that you have on the Switch. Now, while there are some games that do have limitations, there are also some games that this controller excels at. Drop into Street Fighter Collection, for example, and you're set. The rolling D-pad shines in these types of games and feels great when doing quarter and half circles. I can already feel the 90s thumb callus coming back. The other controller Sega sent me was the clear blue design, which looks great as well. I think I still prefer the classic black controller, but it's really hard to deny any translucent controller design. Also, even though it's a clear type of plastic, it still feels the same as the standard black controller overall. You might also be wondering, how would you go back from a game with the Switch? Well, the home button's actually mapped to start and A, so you press that and it'll kick you out to the main menu, at which point you can close the game or navigate around from there. I also tried it on the PC and it's plug and play completely. No problems at all. Fired it up even in a Super Nintendo emulator, it worked great. And if you use it in things like RetroArch, it's found immediately. I didn't try it on a RetroPie, however, I have seen cases where this should work fine because it's seen as just a USB plug and play controller with no issues. So yes, PC emulation, check, works great. Opening the controller is very straightforward with a few Phillips head screws holding the back on. The nice thing about older controllers is it doesn't take much to get them apart for cleaning them, and it's way easier to do maintenance compared to current controllers like a PS4, an Xbox One, or even a Switch Pro controller. With the back off, we can see the controller cable itself is soldered completely to the board, but they left us a little slack inside to make sure even severe pulls on the cable won't put stress on the solder points inside. Taking the board out, I wanted to look at the D-pad right away. I was was hoping Retrobit would use a similar design to the original when approaching the rolling D-pad, and it looks like they did just that. The D-pad itself is locked in using the controller's body as a way to hold the D-pad, but still move around freely. They use plastic guides so it doesn't get too far out of position, and it all adds up to a D-pad that can roll with freedom while still being controlled. Oh, and the board itself really reminds me of how these used to be put together, with thicker motherboards and stiffer rubber membranes inside. These tougher membranes give the buttons a firmer press when playing and keeps them just from feeling cheap. Basically, if you pick up the controller and kind of shake it around, it won't rattle like you'll see the other cheaper ones will, where the buttons will just kind of float around. This one is not like that. It's very solid. Overall, inside, this is a quality controller and has that quality in mind first, which is something I really wanted out of an officially licensed accessory. Good job, Sega, and good job, Retrobit. I mean, really looking at this controller, completely worth it, and it's $20, so it's not even expensive, really, compared to most official controllers. Now, here's the thing. If it became wireless, I would immediately jump to that. Sure, there might be a bit of input lag added to it, and it would probably go up in price to like $30 most likely, but I think that's like the one thing that's really holding it back. I don't even mind as much that it doesn't have all of the buttons that like something like the Switch would need, because it's technically designed for the Genesis Mini first and then the Switch. And I actually like it trying to stay as true to the original as possible, because the games that it does work with on the Switch, for example, it works beautifully for. So yes, this 6-button controller from Retrobit and Sega, completely worth 20 bucks. I recommend picking one up with your Genesis Mini. I really wish this had come with the 6-button controller, even if it just came with one, because it costs more than those 3-button controllers. Although I think they probably could have put 2 of these in there and got away with it, but I actually would have rather them go now to 1 of these than 2, just to make sure the fighting games weren't too bad to play, and then of course you can just buy an extra one if you need it. But let me know what you guys think about the 6-button Retrobit controller down below. If you've already picked it up, I'm curious your thoughts on it. Thanks guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.